Hello YouTube, welcome back. This is a late video, I know. I high-key didn't have internet for a week, and I won't pretend that it wasn't a struggle for me, but I did get some reading done, so if I'm gonna find a bright side in all of this, that would be it. I've got some notes written down. Also, if you're confused about what this is, I keep forgetting that like there might be new people every week. This summer we've been doing a little bit of a book club on this channel for tRicK MiRRor by Gia Tolentino, and this week we are discussing chapter 4, I believe, which is called Pure Heroines. And okay, I'm gonna begin by just disclaimer, this wasn't my favorite essay of the book, and the thing is, I really wanted to like it because it's about literature and books, but the essay did make a lot of references to books that I hadn't read, so it was just a little hard to follow, and maybe that's just a reflection of me not being like well read enough for Gia Tolentino, but no, but yeah, it was just a little hard to follow all the examples she was making, but I did really appreciate all the research she put in to write this essay. I definitely feel like it was necessary, and I really liked all the points she was making, especially the points she makes about how we kind of learn how to be a person through protagonists in books that we read when we grow up. Like, a lot of the messaging in these books that we read form patterns of thinking that manifest in our lives, but also books get written based on how we live our lives, so it kind of turns into another one of those cyclical patterns that she keeps bringing up in this book. It's very cool to me to see just how connected all of these various topics are, because they are very disparate topics, but she is just somehow able to draw all these connections. And also, okay, the other reason why I don't really mind not understanding most of the references in this chapter was because now I guess I'll just never run out of book recommendations. We're trying to retrain our brain into thinking more optimistically. Oh yeah, and then a last general note was that I really enjoyed how she wrote about identity in this essay. Yeah, like from the very beginning, she writes about how in 3rd grade she was playing Power Rangers with her friend, but her friend insisted that she had to play the yellow Power Ranger, and so she writes, "When I realized she wasn't kidding, that she genuinely believed this to be something like a natural law, the anger that hit me was almost hallucinatory. She was saying, in effect, that I had failed to understand my own limits." And it was also really interesting how later on that same page, she kind of sees that as a form of self-delusion. She writes, "That day marked either the beginning of a period of self-delusion or an end of one. Afterward, I still identified with girls in books, but things were different. And surely part of what I love about childhood literary heroines is the way they remind me of that bygone stretch of real innocence, the ability to experience myself however I wanted to." And then she writes about how why heroines are all so brave, where adult heroines are all so bitter. "And I so strongly dislike what has become clear since childhood, the facts of visibility and exclusion in these stories, and the way bravery and bitterness get so concentrated in literature for women because there's not enough space for them in the real world." So that was kind of her intro, the way that she set up this essay. So then for the rest of the essay, she kind of walks us through starting with children's literature, and then going into young adult literature, and then adult literature, and drawing comparisons between those 3 phases. On page 98, she writes, "In children's literature, young female characters are self-evidently important, and their traumas, whatever they may be, are secondary. In adult fiction, if a girl is important to the narrative, trauma often comes first." And then she lists a bunch of examples that I'm not familiar with, except, okay, there's maybe like one book on this list that I have read, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 books in this list, and it's all one sentence. So apart from how these female protagonists' pasts affect how their stories are told, she also writes about how the expectations for women shape how their stories are told. So on page 102, she writes, "In literary stories, and plenty of real-life ones, a wedding signifies the end of individual desire." And a little bit above that on that page, she writes about this quote from the book The Second Sex, and then writes, "This is part of the reason these childhood characters are also independent, so eager to make the most of whatever presents itself. They, or more to the point, their creators, understand that adulthood is always looming, which means marriage, and children, which means, in effect, the end." So yeah, so she does praise like more recent efforts at portraying young women in literature. So on page 103, she writes, "In more recent books, there's much more space around this question. Girls don't feel the same instinctive trepidation about adulthood when its norms are less constrictive." But that's not the end of the essay. So then she goes back to The Second Sex and writes that de Beauvoir, I took a little bit of French, but not enough to know how to pronounce this combination of letters, notes that men, unlike women, experience no contradiction between their gender and their vocation as a human being. She describes the definitive thrill and sorrow of female adolescence, the realization that your body and what people will demand of it will determine your adult life. Then she writes a bunch about the virgin suicides, which I haven't read, and then on page 111, she reflects on these teenage heroines. She writes, "My relationship to female protagonists changed sharply in adolescence. Childhood heroines had shown me who I wanted to be, but teenage heroines showed me who I was afraid of becoming. A girl whose life revolved around her desirability, who is interesting to the degree that her life spun out of control." Wow. I don't even know what I should comment on these, because it's just, she says it too well. Like, there's nothing I can add to this. So then on page 112, she writes a little bit about Rebecca Solnit, who wrote about the time when she was asked in the middle of giving a talk on Virginia Woolf if she thought that Woolf should have had children. Solnit also writes about how she had been asked the same question about her own life a couple years earlier, and then she writes, "Just because the question can be answered doesn't mean that I ought to answer it or that it ought to be asked. The interviewer's question presumed that women should have children and that a woman's reproductive activities were naturally public business." So then Tolentino writes that prescriptions about female behavior, Solnit notes, are often disingenuously expressed in terms of happiness. Now, if this sounds familiar, because it definitely sounded a little too familiar to me, I would like to point you to last week's video. Like, I'm sure Gia was intending this, but it sounds like such a parallel to that. So as a quick refresher, last week's video was about self-optimization. Okay, I don't really remember what I said, so this might not be a great summary, but it's about how we often do things that limit our freedom or just keep reinforcing these stereotypes about how we should be, but we keep doing them because they make us feel happy and fulfilled, because we judge our fulfillment based on how well we're able to fit these roles, and it's like this cycle. And apparently, I mean, I don't know why I didn't think of this as well, but we see this in the books that we read as well. Okay, so that quote that I just read actually continues. She writes, "As if we really want women to be beautiful, selfless, hardworking wives and mothers because that's what will make them happy, when models of female happiness have always tended to benefit men and economically handicap women." Oh my god. Okay, but then Solnit takes us even further. So Gia writes, "But even when women get married, look beautiful, have children, etc., they are still often found deficient," Solnit writes, launching into an unforgettable sentence. "There is no good answer to being a woman. The art may instead lie in how we refuse the question." Wow. Alright, I think that's enough on that point. I don't want to destroy us a little too much here. Okay, so then later on she finally brings in a book that I've read and love, Jenny Offal's Department of Speculation. I read it this past winter and it was incredible. It's in my video of books that I rated 5 stars on Goodreads. Okay, so Gia kind of summarizes a bit, but I'll just paraphrase. So it is narrated by a writer in her 30s who is also a young mother and wants to be an art monster, but also craves domesticity. So then Gia writes that She loves and despises her self-directed constraints. The narrator is brutal and deadpan. She thinks of a, and then this part is like a quote from the book, story about a prisoner at Alcatraz who spent his nights in solitary confinement dropping a button on the floor, then trying to find it again in the dark. Each night, in this manner, he passed the hours until dawn. I do not have a button. In all other respects, my nights are the same. Yeah, it is a great book. Alright, so then what is the point of that part? Okay, the point of that part, Gia writes, it's an acknowledgement from both the narrator and author of the way that social conventions can become fundamental to our selfhood, and sometimes by our own design. Okay, so then at the end of the essay, Gia circles back to how her identity played into her relationship with female protagonists. She writes on page 127, my hesitation as an adult to find myself within the heroine universe has been rooted in a suspicion that that identification would never be truly reciprocal. I would see myself in Jo March, but the world's Jo Marches would rarely, if ever, be expected or able to see themselves in me. On that same page, she writes, if women were not allowed to be seen as emblematic of the human condition, I wouldn't even get to be seen as emblematic of the female condition. Even worse was the fact that the female condition in literature, one of whiteness and confinement, remains so unsatisfying. I was shut out of a realm that I didn't even really want to enter. The heroine's text tells us that, at best, under a minimum of structural constrictions, women are still mostly pulverized by their own lives. Just deep, deep sighs after every single quote. Yeah, so I think that was the last quote I planned to read from this. I don't have that much to add. Ugh, did I just drink a piece of my hair? This essay, I loved a lot of the points it raised. I didn't have that deep of an understanding of a lot of the examples she used though, and to me, I mean, it was cool to see how these like patterns manifested in this other, I guess, industry that I like wouldn't have really thought about, but it did kind of seem like a lot of it was already reflected in essays she'd already written. But that being said, it was kind of hard to grasp them in the first 3 essays just because it was like such a new concept to me. So it was a great opportunity to like get to reinforce them and really like dig deep and start to understand them a bit more. And they do come back in later essays, so get excited for that. Next week's essay is kind of a wild one. Maybe I should put in a little bit of a content warning that if you're underage, she does write very extensively about hard drugs. So if you think that you should skip out on that one, that's totally okay. Like, regardless of whatever topics the essays are, you're always free to like skip out on essays and come back for other essays in this book club. Like, no pressure at all to even follow along at the pace that we're going at, because I know for me, it's already a struggle, like trying to balance this with the Sealy challenge. And I know there's gonna be other things going on in your lives that I'm obviously not aware of. So yeah, no pressure at all. But for those of you who do want to join me in reading next week's essay, I'd love to hear your thoughts when you're done reading it down in the comments below or in the Goodreads discussion page. The link to join the book club is also down below in the description box. And yeah, thanks so much for joining me today. I would love to hear your thoughts, and I will see you next time. Bye!